Well, good afternoon, everyone, or good evening. I see some of you are from the East Coast, and delighted to have you here as part of today's Canadian Studies Centre, Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies event with Don Chapman. I always scroll through to see who's online, and I see Ella, you're there. It's great to see you. I cannot believe I see my friend Tamara Warraby. And Brenda Chapman, welcome. And I don't know Drew, but what a great photo you have. So I love that. I'd love to be out in the snow right now. So welcome, everyone. I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. And I'd like to start by asking you just a little apology about my voice. I'm suffering from a pretty major cold this week, um, so it's a little scratchy. To begin with our land acknowledgement, I am right now up in the Bellingham area, and we experienced that tremendous, what did they call it, a cyclone, small cyclone that really downed a lot of trees, particularly in the area we're in. So pretty dramatic, and causes us to look around at our world and say, wow, Mother Nature is powerful, and we need to pay attention. So with that, I wanted to say that the Jackson School, where Canadian Studies is housed, acknowledges that we're on Coast Salish territory. We're here on the West Coast. This is a traditional homelands of the Duwamish, the Suquamish, Tualatin, Muckleshoot, and other Indigenous peoples. The Jackson School further understands that our international community includes sovereign American Indian tribes, First Nations, Inuit, Métis, and other Indigenous peoples across the world. And in addition, the Canadian Studies Centre also understands that our non-human kin must also be respected and acknowledged for their contributions to our healthy environment. So to welcome all of you and to welcome Don Chapman today. Don Chapman is actually a University of Washington alumnus, and he's a former United Airlines pilot. He was born in Canada, and at the age of 6, Canada canceled his citizenship when his Canadian father became American. Dual citizenship was not allowed. Don, too, became an American. This would become the event that would lead to his future commitment to restore Canadian citizenship rights, both for himself and others. He began this journey in the 1990s. Don is a founder of this concept, lost Canadians, or those individuals who either should have had citizenship but do not, or who lost their citizenship. Don has now spent decades advocating to restore or give Canadian citizenship. His efforts have led to close to 2 million people being able to claim their Canadian citizenship. 2, I may add, from the University of Washington, probably more, but 2 that I know of. Our former Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences and our former Canadian Studies librarian were both able to obtain their citizenship thanks to his work. Don is behind 11 parliamentary bills that have provided greater rights in establishing Canadian identity to women, children, war brides, veterans, Chinese, and Indigenous peoples, including Bill C-71, which is currently before Parliament. He was involved with winning charter challenges on citizenship and equal rights, and in uncovering and correcting some forgotten or unknown histories. Don received an Order of Merit from the Governor-General of Canada in January of this year for his service and contribution to this country. And many of you probably know that this is the greatest honor any Canadian citizen can be awarded. I've known Don for over a decade now, and I have to say that his commitment and his dedication are unstoppable. And he is proof and he is inspiration that any one of us can influence our local and federal governments in ways that may affect many peoples. So with that, Don, I want to turn it over to you. And I wanted to ask you actually two things, Don, if you
Yeah.
wouldn't mind. And that is if you wouldn't mind saying, beginning with a few words about the Order of Merit.
Oh,
Um, I just learned about this recently, and I'm curious to know about the Order of Merit. This is something to be enormously proud of. And also, Don, I know that some online have worked with you and benefited from your work, so they know well what you do. But I know that there's also others online who have no idea about what Lost Canadians are and how one goes about obtaining Canadian citizenship if they quote lost it. And I'm sure a number of people would be interested to know that. So I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind starting with a basic overview of what lost Canadians and Canadian citizenship is. Thank you, Don.
actually, if I could, I think I covered that in my talk. So if I could
Okay.
get to that one, as far as the uh, meritorious service cross, well, I have a team, and everybody on that team deserves this. And I'm going to treat it a little bit like the Stanley Cup, that at the summertime, everybody gets to take the cup home. Well, I just happened to see Schneur Rabin. He's one of my team members. Schneur is going to get that. I'm going to send it to him as well because nobody does anything by themselves. We all stand on somebody's shoulders. So, yes, I received it, but and I'm very lucky to have gotten it. But there are a lot of people uh, uh, that deserve more and will end up taking this home for just a little bit. That's it right there on my collar. So, and Mary and I, we will skip the second slide just on time. So in a minute, we'll go to the third. But what I wanted to do, I'll start by saying thank you very much, Nadine. Thank you to all of you. Uh, my parents taught me that every person is in some way my superior, and from that person, I can learn. Well, that's also true with countries everywhere in all lands. If you dig deep enough, you'll find both good and bad. No country has an exclusive on perfection nor on stupidity. My talk, as you know, is on Canadian citizenship and lost Canadians, where I will expose a darker side of Canada. Likewise, if my talk was about the United States and slavery, you'd hear bad things. Canada is a great country, as is the US, where the good far outweighs the bad. I'm a citizen of both, and I love both countries. Now, in every discussion on Lost Canadians, I seem to default back to the same starting point. But that's important in that many of you have not heard of this story, and hence to really gain an understanding of where you personally might fit into the big picture, you need some perspective. First question, how did I get involved with Lost Canadians? Next, how did I become, if you will, the founding member? Well, the answer is multifaceted. Canada stripped me of my own citizenship, as Nadine said, when I was 6 years old. Why? Because I was born in Canada in wedlock and I was not adopted. Had any of those three factors been different, I would have kept my citizenship, or said differently, I would have remained Canadian had I been born outside of Canada, out of wedlock, or had I been adopted. Confused? Well, of course, especially when you judge the issue by today's standards. The next question is, how did Canada get these laws in their books? Who wrote this incredibly awful and discriminatory legislation? The answer, which may not be a surprise, is pompous, rich British white men. Their English laws date back hundreds of years, with all the former British colonies adopting them. Word for word, here's the exact language of what I've been trying to change for decades. Married women, minors, lunatics, and idiots will be classified under the same disability for their national status. Now, in the real world, what were the consequences of that language? Married women were property or chattel of their husbands. Children were property of their fathers if born in wedlock, and property of the mothers if born out of wedlock. The Scarlet A was alive and thriving and tightly woven into the British and Canadian fabric. And the consequences didn't just affect women. I'm a perfect example. A young boy stripped of his nationality due to gender discrimination against his mother, all because she's a woman. Here's another example. There are lost Canadians who were born out of wedlock, and for this reason, their birth certificates had the word bastard stamped across it in bold red letters, like the child had anything to do with it. A commonality, if you will, was the judgment that the out of wedlock child was the fault of the mother, like men had no part, even if the woman had been raped. Today, regrettably, the US seems hell bent in wanting to turn their society backwards to embrace some of those horrid laws. And as I can attest, it won't be pretty. And certainly, it's not where any country should be, nor strive to go back to. And like I explained, it doesn't just hurt women, it hurts children, men, and all of society. And if you want to go back to the main screen, Marion, that's to take that picture off. There we go. I witnessed firsthand, up close and personal, how gender discrimination against women directly affected me. And if you want to, I see that it's stuck on Lost Canadians. If you want to go back, Marion, just to show me or whatever you want, the pictures come up when they come up. So you can just take that off if you want. It doesn't matter. I'll just continue on. I said, it directly affected me and my citizenship, my identity, my culture, and my life. And as a carryover, the lives of my children and grandchildren. Now, for those old anachronistic former British laws, Canada today seems to be the only remaining former British colony that is yet to fully clean up the inherited mess. And ironically, even the UK has corrected their old laws. Canada is the outlier. So, how did I lose my citizenship? In 1961, my father, well, my whole family had moved from Vancouver to Seattle, and my Canadian father took out US citizenship. And since I was his chattel, Canada canceled my citizenship as well. It mattered not that I never vowed citizenship to the United States, nor that I never renounced my Canadian citizenship. I was my dad's property, and that was that. Fortunately, the US gave me citizenship. Otherwise, I would have been stateless. At the time, I was all of 6 years old. Later, when I turned 18 in 1972, I went back to Canada and asked for my citizenship to be restored. It was not to be. Apparently, I had come from the hardest country in the world to get into Canada from. I came from Canada. It was as though their government believed that I had willingly given up my citizenship, so therefore there'd be no easy path to get it back. In the end, it took 47 years for me to become Canadian again. And to do so, I had to immigrate back to my own homeland. And now if you show the picture of my Canadian visa for just a minute, and you'll see that's my birth certificate, Vancouver. And then on the right side, I had to become an immigrant into my own country. Okay, if you take that back off and we'll go back to the regular screen. Another area of importance in this story is my psyche. I was an airline pilot. In my profession, pilots are known to have some common traits, such as with any airplane accident or incident, we want to know why and how it happened. Immediately, investigations commence to uncover every possible nuance. No stone is left unturned. Another pilot trait is you don't leave people behind. For example, I can't imagine any pilot ditching a plane on the Hudson River in New York and then willingly choosing to leave people on the plane. Think of Captain Sully Sullenberger. Pilots do everything in their power to rescue everyone as they should. Likewise, I felt the same way towards lost Canadians. Now for another pilot trait. When pilots go to work, they leave town. In my case, flying internationally, I left the country, which meant that I was out of town for days at a time, leaving my wife and daughters home alone. Hence, pilots aren't keen to broadcast out and into the public arena that they're regularly gone. And because of this reluctance, it took some prodding from a journalist friend who wanted to write about my story. His article appeared in the Vancouver province, and within a week or two of its publication, 3 people contacted me saying that they too were having difficulty getting Canadian citizenship. 2 were like me, born in Canada, and the other had been born in the US to 2 Canadian parents. Apparently, my story touched a nerve, and I wasn't alone in this universe. That's when this thought entered into my head. How could I be a good Canadian by getting my citizenship restored, knowing that there were others out there like me who weren't so lucky? How could I choose silence? Aren't we supposed to think of others, to do right by our fellow man? For me, it wasn't a choice. I had to fight for everyone. Thus began the David and Goliath battle, me against the government of Canada. Time stamped, it was the late to mid, or rather mid to late 1990s, just as the internet was being born. Being a tech novice, I hired someone to put together a website. First decision, picking a name to call ourselves. My choice, which has now become widely known around the world as Lost Canadians. Straight away, I heard from Charles and Peg Bosdet. Charles, like me, was born in Canada, and when he was a minor, his Canadian father took out U.S. citizenship. Shortly after that, a Vancouver lawyer connected me to Magali Castro Gear, who was exactly like Charles and me, except that Canada had rendered her stateless. After that, we hooked up with a Vancouver lawyer, a patent and copyright lawyer, no less, making up a foursome of what Magali would later describe as Canadian freedom fighters. Together, we were off to the Ottawa battlefields, first to testify before the Parliamentary Committee in January 2003 were Magali and me. A bill had been tabled, a mint fresh, brand new Citizenship Act, and how telling that almost all the MPs, including the media, had never before heard of Lost Canadians, nor did they know that Canada had been, for decades, canceling or denying citizenship against its own people, often due to the most egregious of reasons. Our campaign also became a battle to educate, which had its own unique perspective. See, Canadians have been taught, in fact, it's been drilled into them, that their country is a country of human rights. Combine that with Canada accepting hundreds of thousands of immigrants per year, it made it so that Canadians simply could not fathom the thought that their human rights country would turn its back on its own people. As individual Lost Canadians, we were looked at with an enormous amount of skepticism. In the US, they would have asked, "What has the government done to you?" In Canada, it was the opposite, as Canadians would say, "You must have done something really awful for the government to strip you of your citizenship. What did you do?" It was like the reason any of us could no longer be Canadian was because we'd personally done something terribly wrong, that it was of our own doing, our own fault. Certainly, it couldn't be the government's. Another difference between the US psyche and Canada is the media. Almost always, with any media coverage we got, it became a one-off with no follow-up. In the US, the media would have been all over the story, but not in Canada. I'll get back to the media a bit later. In time, several Canadian legislative bills failed as they made their way through the parliamentary process, but one single bill actually crossed the finish line and passed. And it became law, Bill S2, and it became effective on May 5th, 2005. Magali, Charles, and I could finally become Canadian, but not without restrictions, such as we weren't allowed to bring our children with us. In essence, what Canada had done to me as a 6-year-old in 1961, it was now doing the same thing to my children almost half a century later, turning them away via legislated exclusion. Again, back to my pilot psyche. When evacuating an aircraft during an emergency, to the best of our ability, pilots are to stay on board to make certain that all passengers and all crew members have been safely evacuated. Once again, it didn't feel right and proper for me to get my citizenship knowing other Lost Canadians under different circumstances were still out there and being shunned. By now, people were contacting me with some regularity and telling me their stories. There were the war brides, the war bride children, women having less rights to confer citizenship than men. We knew of 3 or 4 ways in which Canada had stripped or denied people of citizenship. Apparently, unbeknownst to me, Lost Canadians had entered a stage of emerging growth where, over time, my small team and I discovered at least 15 ways a person or groups of people could be stripped or denied citizenship, or better stated, of joining the ranks of people who became known as Lost Canadians. And know that when you fight City Hall, or in our case, when you fight the federal government, they don't come out and say, "Hey, look, if you go over there and look under that rock, you'll discover something that will help your case." You're forced to fight, to crawl, to run, to investigate every possible lead out there. And more often than not, discovering new categories of lost Canadians came about when individuals contacted me and explained their seemingly unique situation. What became a watershed moment was when a government insider became our whistleblower, secretly telling me about other factions of lost Canadians. We simply had to fight for everyone. By now, Peg Bosdet, Charles' wife, had become my full-time researcher and fellow rebel. She's also responsible for discovering many avenues of disenfranchisement for any and all problems with particular or unique twists, big or small. Peg was the one who untangled the mess. Likewise, Peg reached back into the legislative history to discover so many horrors, such as Indigenous citizenship legislation or an almost unknown history of Canada with regards to citizenship. No question about it. Canada deserves a gold medal for covering up its past. The country's slogans, peace, order, and good government, fairness, compassion, and human rights, have not always, and still are not always, followed nor put into practice. Canada's past is fraught with discrimination and exclusion. Particularly affected were Indigenous people, Chinese and Japanese Canadians, Jewish Canadians, East Indian Canadians, and always, at every turn, women. One such example are the famous five women. In the late 1920s, Emily Murphy became the first female magistrate, not only in Canada but within the entire British Empire. On the first hour of the first day, opposing counsel asked that she be replaced as the judge. Asking why, counsel explained that judicially, an applicant or respondent had a right to have a person oversee the proceedings. You see, in Canada in the 1920s, in law, per the 1867 British North American Act, women were chattel or property. They had yet to be defined as people, or for an individual, as a person. It took a British Privy Council order in October 1929 for women to become real persons in Canada. Women could now be judges and senators, but what they didn't win was the right to confer citizenship to their children. That didn't happen until 2009 under Lost Canadian Bill C-37, and then it only applied to women going forward, not retroactively. On a positive note, with our current Bill C-71, women will be able to confer citizenship retroactively, and I'll get back to that in just a bit. Now, I must say, the absolute worst thing that anyone could ever do to a woman is to separate her from her children. As the law stood in Canada, and in some aspects it remains this way, forced family separation is exactly what the Citizenship Act did and does. Apparently, our fight was no longer just about the here and now. It was also to correct Canada's historic discrimination. Now, how do you do that, especially when the government so controls much of the media, the education system, and the narrative? By now, we'd become a team of 5 or 6 people: myself, Peg Bosdet, Fred Colburn, Robert Addington, and Jackie Scott. 5 aging seniors up against a government wall of denial and misinformation, such as Mackenzie King. And you'll see on the screen right now, the day the Prime Minister was handed the first Canadian Certificate of Citizenship. But I also put a red arrow by the January 3 of 2019, because see, that was reported in the CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, just a few years ago. And there, if you look down at his Certificate of Canadian Citizenship, it's numbered 0001. So Prime Minister Mackenzie King, I mean, in 1947, he had himself sworn in as the very first person to legally hold Canadian citizenship. Canadians in the media largely bought into King's false narrative. So too did IRCC, which is Immigration, Refugees, Citizenship Canada, where in the ensuing decades, the January 1947 pretend start date was used with some regularity as the reason to deny or cancel people of citizenship. And Marion, if you want to go back and take it off that slide. Anyway, for example, in 2006, Canada forced 47,000 World War II war brides and 22,000 of their children into a judicial review in Vancouver with the clear purpose of saying they were not citizens, never had been. And the justification? Mackenzie King's almost 60-year-old false narrative that citizenship in Canada began on January 1st of 1947. Lying has real consequences. Now, before I explain why King did what he did, along with some history of Canada, let me say that one of the greatest attributes of Canadians is that they're so wonderfully nice. And one of their greatest faults is they're so wonderfully nice. Far more than their American counterparts, Canadians are less likely to question things or to buck up against the powers that be. The pressing question is, in 1947, why didn't people en masse question the Prime Minister when he claimed to be the very first citizen of the North? Where was the media? Back to the US-Canada comparisons. I can't imagine the US press doing the proverbial three-monkey routine of hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil. But I have witnessed this in Canada, even more recently. For example, in 2006, when the war brides were in judicial review, the Canadian press, an organization supposedly dedicated to report all Canadian news, didn't do a single story, not one, on lost Canadians. Yet that same year, they did 345 stories combined on Lindsay Lohan, Britney Spears, Celine Dion, and Paris Hilton. In an 11-year time frame, the Canadian press did 32 stories on us. For comparison, they wrote about cats 4,896 times, paper towels 433, Pamela Anderson 384, toads 117, spaghetti 599, and Marilyn Monroe 440. The only thing we beat out was dog poop, which got 22 stories, and again, we had 32. How telling is that? A Hollywood starlet who'd been dead for 44 years beat us by a ratio of more than 14 to 1. The media just didn't seem to care. Or did they? Could there have been government interference or the fear of government reprisal? Nadine Fabi, the host of today's talk, will remember back to April 2010 when I spoke here at the U. Back then, she didn't mention anything to me prior to my speech, but well before I arrived, the Canadian consulate had called her asking that I not be allowed to talk. Was Canada afraid that I might say something derogatory, like telling the truth? Nadine then did exactly what she should have done. She explained that the university is an institution of free speech. She then invited the Canadian government folks to attend my speech, telling them that they'd be free to challenge me publicly, forcing me to prove anything I said. She also told them that she wouldn't tell me about their call. That is until after my speech had concluded. Of course, no one showed up to challenge me, probably because they knew I wasn't wrong. Was this a one-off? Or was it a government pattern? Consider this. 4 months earlier, in January 2010, Amy Goodman of NPR's Democracy Now! Was entering Canada at the Blaine crossing when Canadian border agents confiscated her laptop. They said that if she was going to Canada to say anything bad about the Olympics, she would be denied entry. For a third example, in January 2007, investigative reporters Gary Simmons and Suzanne Reber of the CBC went public, saying that there were hundreds of thousands of lost Canadians. Immediately, the government shot back, calling them rogue reporters. Afterwards, on that same day, the CBC caved. The result, CBC's reporting on lost Canadians pretty much ended right then and there. And it didn't help us in our battle for change, nor did it go unnoticed by the CBC top brass, especially when the government canceled $2.4 million worth of funding to the CBC, all having to do with the issue of lost Canadians and citizenship. In time, the truth emerged that Gary and Suzanne's reporting was accurate in every way but one. They had severely underestimated the numbers of lost Canadians. We didn't know it then, but we do now. The numbers are into the millions. To be clear, the interference by the government with all three of my examples was headed by the then Prime Minister Stephen Harper's government. But even today, under the Liberals, Catherine Tate, CBC's president, won't get involved despite having children of her own who are lost Canadians. Same thing for the children of global nationals anchorwoman Donna Friesen. Do they care or not care about their fellow Canadians? Are they afraid of government reprisal? Well, this is happening in the Canadian media in the here and now. What about 80 years ago? Surely, wouldn't someone in the media have questioned King's assertion that he was Canada's first citizen, especially when World War II had just ended, with Canada having a combined 111,000 soldiers who died during both World Wars? I mean, if the soldiers weren't Canadian, then what were they? Wasn't there even a small tidbit of journalistic rousing? Apparently not. And on the screen right now is Jackie Scott, who's one of my team members, questioning the then citizenship minister, Jason Kenney. And he's saying, nope, sorry, they were our heroes, but they certainly weren't Canadian citizens. So back to what I have to say, I would say, think about it. Over 100,000 soldiers gave their lives defending Canada. And Prime Minister Mackenzie King, probably without realizing the consequences of his decision, gives all of them the proverbial boot out of the Canadian family. Adios. Goodbye. Good riddance. See you. Wouldn't want to be you. Now let's turn to the U.S. media and everyday Americans. Would they have remained silent if the U.S. government had done this to their vets? I can't imagine it. But in Canada, to this day, the sounds of silence continue. Simon and Garfunkel's 1964 song of that title warned about silence and indifference in society. The takeaway was that it is important, extremely important, to question authorities. And as pilots, we demand it. If something doesn't look right, or if a pilot is uncomfortable about something, we're to speak up. It should be that way for politics as well. Never, ever should any representative of the people be able to do or say just anything unchecked. Which takes me to another current comparison between Canada and the US. Misinformation. My team remains embedded in the trenches, fighting the false narrative that Canadian citizenship began in 1947. Speaking out against us are history books, academia, the government, museums, and even court rulings. All the above have been influenced by 80-year-old misinformation, which came about due to a politician on the bully pulpit saying whatever it took for him or her to be reelected and to keep their job. The fact is, truth can easily go by the wayside to falsehoods and misleading information. Sound eerily familiar, like with the recent U.S. elections? The German philosophy during World War II was the more outrageous and more frequently you hear a lie, the easier it's believed. The people of the U.S. now have an horrendous task in front of them, one that's likely to extend a century or more in unraveling Trump's lies. For the good of everyone, they should never give up. As Maya Angelou said, you can't really know where you are going until you know where you've been. Truth matters. Accordingly, my Lost Canadian team has and will persevere. As for the existence of pre-1947 citizenship and its legal rights, citizenship in Canada has been there since Confederation, period and full stop. Take the statement from Canada's first Governor General just after Confederation. In November 1867, he said, "Canada has just created a new nationality." Indeed, it had. Now let me explain the difference between citizenship and nationality. Nationality, for the most part, is the country in which you belong. Citizenship, for most of the world, are the rights one acquires when reaching the age of majority, such as the right to vote or being able to participate in government. The US and Canada have conflated the two such that they have come to mean the same thing. But looked at through a worldwide lens, as most countries do, the two are quite different. Likewise, in both the US and Canada, there's a right to citizenship by means of jus soli, which is birth on soil. Many countries use jus sanguine, which means a child's nationality or citizenship is determined by the citizenship and or substantial connection of one or both of their parents. Greece, Japan, China, Belgium do not give citizenship to a baby just because it's born in their country. Hence, I've dealt with several stateless babies born to a Canadian citizen parent, most being born in a country that doesn't recognize jus soli. But there were other ways to be stateless. For example, the September 2007 United Nations Human Rights magazine, Refugees, highlighted Canada as an offending country and making people stateless. Its title, The Strange Hidden World of the Stateless. And if you'll turn, there we go. And if you look at the bottom left-hand corner, that lady is getting her citizenship. She was in her 70s. Actually, she was stateless for more than 70 years, and her name was Barbara Porteous. And that was the right across the bottom. It says a few slip-ups in the framing of citizenship law can have extraordinary repercussions. That was that magazine was talking about Canada. Now let's go to the next video.
Well, we've told you this story over the past few years, the one of the so-called lost Canadians, people who always thought they were Canadian, but suddenly discovered they were not. It was all because of a little-known law. After our stories, the government promised a fix, and fast. So why were so many still lost Canadians protesting today? Our senior correspondent, Terry Milewski, went to find out. They're still out in the cold, the last of the so-called lost Canadians, people who lost their Canadian citizenship or never got it because of mysterious quirks in the law. The government pledged to fix their problems, but dozens are still being denied a passport, even if they're descended from a Canadian hero. Some are descended from a female Canadian instead of a male. Some are the children of war brides. Some were just born in the wrong place. Like the newest lost Canadian, little Rachel Chandler. Her Canadian dad works in China, where she was born. Now, at 5 months old, she is cute, blue-eyed, and stateless. The Chinese say she's not Chinese, but even though Rachel's father is Canadian, he too was born outside Canada, so she's out of luck.
She absolutely has the right to be a Canadian citizen. There's no question about it.
The baby's father, grandfather, and aunt are all Canadian. Still, Rachel cannot even enter Canada.
I would love to have my niece with me. I would like to show her off around Mississauga. I would like to show her to my friends.
Little Rachel is only the latest poster child for the lost Canadians. 81 of them are still telling their stories of bureaucratic absurdity.
My father was a Canadian soldier in the Second World War, and I'm being denied citizenship because my parents weren't able to marry until I was 2.
But because I was born in 1945.
Then there's Archie Ford. His mom was Canadian, but that was before they allowed mothers to pass on their nationality. The immigration minister says just follow the process.
Rather than having, press conferences or trying to politicize their application, just make a solid application, make a strong case, and it'll be considered fairly on the merits of their case.
But the lost Canadians say that's just the problem, that they do bring solid cases and still get turned down. As for baby Rachel in China, she's either going to be stateless or Irish. Turns out that her Canadian grandfather was born in Ireland, and the Irish government says no problem, if she can't be a Canadian, we'll take her. Terry Milewski, CBC News, Ottawa.
But folks, we're talking about Canada, the self-proclaimed human rights country. Now you may ask, how much media attention did this receive in Canada? The answer, about 1 minute's worth, if that, on the CBC. And you have there, that's Rachel, the little girl, the baby that we're talking about. It took 13 years for us to get her citizenship, and that was forced family separation. The father couldn't live in China because he wasn't Chinese, and Rachel couldn't live in Canada because she wasn't Canadian. And there are real horrendous things going on here. Like with residential schools and the Indigenous people, the one thing you never do is separate children from their parents. But that's what Canada did, and in some ways still does. Let's go to the next picture, and this is another person that was stateless, and she was Magali, one of my first people that we hooked up with. So if you could play that video.
Government made me an offer in May of 2003, outside of court, that I had to leave Canada. I had to come back as an immigrant with my entire family. I had to go through a medical clearance. I had to go through a security clearance. I had to then reside in Canada for 1 year, and then I had to apply to resume my citizenship. And I had to stop my court case. And I could not go public with the story. This is a gag order. What is that? Canada telling me I have to sign on this dotted line and shut up, and we'll give you citizenship. To me, I don't think I'll ever get over the shock that I mean, even now reading it, I just can't believe that they would do that.
And now let's go to another video.
The federal government has apologized to a 98-year-old Vancouver woman who was imprisoned and stripped of her Canadian citizenship back in 1939.
The reason it happened to Velma Demerson, she married and had a child with a Chinese immigrant. CTV Shannon Patterson reports.
Please accept my apology, our apology.
From a Canadian senator and 2 members of parliament.
Is not right.
Words 98-year-old Velma Demerson has waited decades to hear.
I bring you the apology from the government of Canada for taking away your citizenship, for having been imprisoned.
Her crime in 1939, getting pregnant out of wedlock.
Well, I was 18 when I met him.
Did you fall in love?
Oh yeah, sure.
The baby's father was a Chinese immigrant.
For that offense, the province of Ontario declared her to be incorrigible. And then, oh my goodness, it was a mixed-race baby, so that was even worse. So they put her into the Mercer Reformatory Prison for Women. And while she was there, they practiced medical experimentation on her. Well, she was pregnant.
It wasn't only the drugs, it was the physical part of it that they were doing, which was unbelievable.
Her son Harry was born with serious medical problems.
I contacted my husband when I got out. We got married, got my son to the hospital, and he was in such poor condition.
For marrying a Chinese man, she was stripped of her Canadian citizenship.
So here's a woman that can't even make a living. I mean, she's had to go underground, if you will, and just scratch by with anybody who just pay her cash.
Demerson persevered and became an advocate for so-called lost Canadians.
Velma's one of many.
How did it feel to hear "I'm sorry" on behalf of the Prime Minister?
It felt good.
She regained her citizenship in 2004, despite everything, proud to call herself Canadian. Shannon Patterson, CTV News, Vancouver.
That's hard to believe. I mean, that Canada was in the same business as Joseph Mengele. But to this day, Canadians remain largely unaware of this story. Now, remember how I said that married women were chattel of their husbands? Tens of thousands of Canadian women married American husbands. Upon marriage before 1947, those women were rendered stateless. Pray tell, who may have fallen into this quagmire? Actor Gene Hackman's mother. Same for Shirley MacLaine's mother, or Walt Disney's mother. There was Mary Pickford, Norma Shear, and lots of others. And far too often, their children, like my children, also became victims. Chinese Canadians were told they were nothing more than stateless registered aliens. Here's a copy of Douglas Jung's registration under the Canada's Department of Immigration and Colonization from the early 1920s. Notice the last sentence where it says, "This certificate does not establish legal status in Canada." It didn't matter that Jung was born in Canada and had no other nationality. There were also stateless Indigenous Canadians. That was a young lady, Heather Harnois. She couldn't get Indian status or citizenship. We got both for her in time. Their citizenship status for Indigenous people wasn't secured until the early 1960s. I'll never forget my first email from Donovan McLaughlin. He'd been stateless from birth, despite being born in Canada. In his email, he said that a dog in Canada had more legal rights than he did. And he was First Nations. And I do want to make one comment about Indigenous people like Donovan. And there were 3 ways for an Indigenous parents to keep their child from being forced to attend a residential school. One was leave Canada, but to go where? You had no legal rights, so you'd be sent back. 2 was do what's called enfranchise, which was to give up your Indian status and exchange it for Canadian citizenship, which is kind of interesting if citizenship didn't exist before 1947, yet Canada was enfranchising back to Confederation. And the last way with Donovan is don't register the birth of your child And that's what his parents did. And so for the rest of his life, he suffered with that. Okay, here's another lost Canadian. This is a gentleman, and the article was written by one of my current team members, Randy Winter. And Justin Roy is a D-Day survivor. I mean, he has scars up and down his arms from hand-to-hand combat with a German. He landed on D-Day on June 6th. And when he came back to Canada after the war in Ontario, he couldn't collect veterans benefits because they said, you're not Canadian. He went into the Canadian Legion. They wouldn't have anything to do with it. They said, no, you have no rights to be a member of the Legion. And by the way, the same thing was true with the Chinese Canadian veterans. The Legion wouldn't have them either. And then also with Justin, he went into a local bar to get a drink, and they said, we don't serve Indians here. So he packed his car with his wife, left, and never came back to Canada. But he's yet to be recognized as a Canadian citizen, despite being a D-Day survivor in a unit that was just hammered. Very few made it out in his unit. And two, after being born in Canada. Let's go to another one. This was the center one. We got all three their citizenship. That's Willie Van E. And he was born to an Indigenous Canadian soldier in World War II and a Dutch war bride mother. And he was denied his citizenship. We finally got it for him. And you can see, I mean, this is a picture from Holland, and he's got an Indigenous pole behind him. And anyway, but it took several years longer to get his kids in. And now to Japanese Canadians. Mackenzie King, our fake first citizen, issued an order in council in 1945 to strip all Japanese Canadians of their citizenship. Or on a side note, an order in council in Canada is what a presidential executive order is in the US. King's motive was to make Canada an all-white country, making good on the speech he gave to the British Parliament in 1908, where he called the Chinese Canadians coolies and peons. And if you'll show that, this is 1908. I mean, it says, right, I mean, it's shocking to see this stuff. And Canada, as I say, has covered this stuff up because we couldn't find this in any history books in Canada. We had actually found it in the British Parliament. But it says that Canada should desire to restrict immigration from the Orient is regarded as natural. That Canada should remain a white man's country is believed to not only be desirable for economic and social reasons, but highly necessary on political and national grounds. Then he called the Chinese peons of the Orient and coolie immigrants. I mean, this is what we were fighting. And King is a guy who called himself the first ever Canadian citizen. So let's go back here to, let's see, I somehow lost my stuff. So let's, there we go. Have I said that Canada should get the gold for covering up its past? Almost none of this history is well known. Anticipating your next question, how could King cancel citizenship in 1945 if citizenship didn't exist until 1947? Answer, he couldn't. Next question, why did he issue the order in council? Well, because after World War II, the newly formed United Nations, based on what had happened to the Jews in Germany, made it a crime against humanity for a country to deport its own citizens. Hence, for King to be able to rid Canada of non-whites, and after the war with the Japanese Canadians being considered the low-hanging fruit, the only way for him to do it without being charged with a crime was to first cancel their citizenship and then to deport them. They'd be the first of many non-whites to go. Facing tremendous blowback, in the end, King stripped and had deported 3,997 Japanese Canadians, 700 of whom were children born in Canada. Only then, to help cover up what he'd done, did he have himself sworn in as Canada's first citizen. And that, folks, is where Canada is today, saying in several of our court challenges that citizenship began on January 1st, 1947. A rather neat cover-up, if you will. with no one challenging it till the Lost Canadian team did its own investigation. To reiterate, the false narrative began when the top politician in Canada made up a story as a cover-up to his misdeeds and told in a way to bolster his ego and career. So what's new in Canada or the US or anywhere else in the world where politicians gather? Now, with another court case in hand, the Lost Canadians are now willing and ready to fight the government to capture the very people who gave their lives for the rest of us. On the screen right now is a booklet given to the soldiers in 1942 as they headed off to war. It's published on the King's Printer, which means it's an official Canadian publication. It's called Battle of Brains, Canadian Citizenship and the Issues of War. And it was telling the soldiers, kind of like a pep rally book, hey, you're going off to fight in World War II, and you're fighting as a Canadian citizen. So it's interesting how things get twisted after a while. Have I said shame on Canada? My point is that history is extremely important. Think of how many states in the US are banning books or trying to rewrite history. Have I mentioned Greenwood, Oklahoma, or slavery? Like a plane crash accident investigation, truth is what matters. Good, bad, or indifferent, just tell it like it is. Going forward, Bill C-71 is our current Lost Canadian bill, which is a result of our constant efforts and our court case victory last December. The judge ruled that the Canadian Citizenship Act was, in its present form, unconstitutional, which is something I've been saying for decades. Bill C-71 is the government's bill which came about from our court victory. When it passes and is made effective, it will give or restore citizenship to people that, if not for the discriminatory legislation, would have had a right to citizenship. The legislation this time is retroactive, which means that if you had a parent or grandparent that was Canadian, you too will probably have a claim. Until then, the Citizenship Act has 6 glaring deficiencies. Bill C-71 corrects 4 of them. On the positive side, with C-71's passage, women will finally have the same rights to confer citizenship to their children that men have long enjoyed. And it will be the first time ever that Canadian Citizenship Act becomes charter compliant. To clarify, in Canada, a charter challenge is what in the US they would call a constitutional challenge. What C-71 does not address is just when did citizenship begin? And as I've said, the fate of all of Canada's pre-1947 war debt is at stake. C-71 also does not address whether Canadian citizenship is a right or a privilege. In the US, it's a right. In Canada, a privilege. Think about this. If he could, would Trump cancel Obama's, Harris's, or Biden's citizenship? Of course he would. In Canada, if we elect a Trump-like prime minister, that person could easily eliminate the opposition parties and that he or she could cancel everyone's citizenship, which in turn cancels their right to vote. Citizenship is really the right to have rights. Without it, a person can't get a passport. There's little police protection, no health insurance. You could be deported, no pensions, no driver's license, no government ID, no air travel. You can't even get married. Last question. What was the first thing Hitler did after taking power? He canceled the German Jews' citizenship. He understood only too well what the rights of citizenship means. 100 years later, many people, including politicians in both the US and Canada, do not grasp its importance. Citizenship and the right of belonging is a very big deal indeed, and it must be protected. Now, this next slide, just to quickly, I've been involved in 11 parliamentary bills. On the slide there are 10 of them. The current bill, if you go to the next slide, is Bill C-71, which is making its way through Parliament right now. And I've also been involved in several court challenges. The one on the left is the Bjorkquist decision. Then the middle one is a court case we will file if the government doesn't agree that if they want to fight me on pre-47 citizenship. That is a matter of honor of the crown to me, and that is especially fitting for Indigenous people and the Chinese, because as I said with Douglas Jung's registration, It said this certificate does not establish any legal status. They were considered to be nothing more than stateless registered aliens. We cannot, just simply cannot allow the history books to continue with a false narrative, especially when they were Canadian. Now, before I get to the questions, I'd like to just quickly read an excerpt from my book, The Lost Canadians. And it's from the chapter, That's a Wrap. And it's where I talk about discrimination. I kind of define it as to what the ramifications are. So here goes. When one peels away everything but the underlying elements, our issue is really about discrimination with an emphasis against women. The result being the loss of one's citizenship. Deciphering the matter through my pilot lens, I often compare the issue to being in the cockpit of an airplane during an emergency with an engine fire. Let's say the fire warning bell is going off, the left engine fire handle is illuminated, and I don't have a clue what to do next. Although that's not the case, I'm well trained in the procedures. But to illustrate the point, I'll make myself out as the one who's both ignorant and incompetent. I turn to the other pilot and say, I don't know what to do. The pilot, who just happens to be female, responds, I know exactly what to do. To which I say, because you're a woman, I don't want to know. In the next scene, the plane crashes and everyone dies. It's almost hard to imagine that a person could be so filled with discrimination that they willingly ignore knowledge, and in doing so, they too suffer the consequences of their ignorance. But that's really what transpires whenever discrimination is allowed to fester, no matter what form it takes. And regrettably, it happens all the time. It's not just the victim who suffers, but also the perpetrator and society. Our existence in this world is limited at best, and yet, as humans, we expend enormous amounts of energy and time on stupid issues like Lost Canadians. And by the way, I say that it's a stupid issue because it should never have been an issue in the first place. But anyway, I wrote, it would be far better for humanity if we used our time on really important causes like finding cures for cancer or developing green energy. The nanosecond that discrimination is discovered, no matter what form it morphs into, it should be eradicated. Should women have equal rights with men? Yes, absolutely. How about blacks and whites and everybody in between? Of course. Equal rights, equal opportunity, period, and full stop. And Canada likes to say, we stand on guard for thee. And I sometimes question that and say, or do we? Because I have found that Canadians haven't been very good at standing up for one another. And anyway, there's one more slide, I think is the first one we started with. And after that, I'll take any questions or comments or whatever you'd like to talk about. I'm all ears.
Don, thank you so much. That was just a fabulous overview and tremendously interesting. I do have, so we'll have time for questions, and I see that there's at least one in the chat. But if I could start with one, Don. Prior to 1947 in Canada, they called it prior to 1947, it was called a certificate of naturalization that was used to declare as a British subject living in Canada. I'm just curious, that certificate of naturalization, how did that play into the Lost Canadians? And I guess what I'm interested in is, if most individuals were the Chinese immigrants, did they have a certificate of naturalization? If you had a certificate of naturalization, could you trade that up for citizenship the moment Mackenzie King, quote, brought in citizenship? Just curious where that fits in.
In 1901, and under the Canadian census, they defined Canadian citizenship, and they said Canadian citizenship, nationality, and saying the word Canadian all means the same thing. The 1910 Immigration Act wasn't about who is an immigrant. It was about who is not an immigrant. And they defined three classes of Canadian citizen. And it was, you were born in Canada, you're a British subject with Canadian domicile, or you were naturalized. And so the idea that we were all British subjects, that's also not true, because Canada couldn't confer British subject status to a non-British subject person. So if somebody came, like in World War II, we had people from the US that came to Canada and fought. And if they took out Canadian citizenship, they didn't become British subjects. So Canada made up this thing that we were British subjects. Yes, most of us were. But we were, if you will, Canadian nationals, Canadian citizens, British subjects, and British citizens. It was kind of all four. And British subject status still didn't go away for a long, long time, you know, into the 1990s. I mean, they're still vowing a lot of stuff to the king at this point. So that has just been kind of a shiny object in the corner that the Canadian government has used.
Okay, thank you. And this is from one of our participants. And please, you can just either raise your hand or start talking or put it into the chat, and I'm happy to read it. But if you would like to talk to Don, which would be lovely, just put your hand up. So this is from Tamara Warby. Is there a new government bill? Is there a new government before Bill C-71? I'm sorry, if there's a new government before Bill C-71 is passed, what do you think is a likelihood that it will be considered under Conservatives?
Well, they will have no choice to put a bill in. However, the Canadian government hasn't always been very good in the past. In 1997, under a Supreme Court decision, Benner versus Canada, combining with a 2004 decision, Auger versus Canada, it said that all foreign-born children to a Canadian parent, male, female, in or out of wedlock, didn't matter. They had the right of citizenship. So that meant that had I been born outside of Canada, I would have been Canadian. And when I said that to the Senate in April of 2004, the top bureaucrat came in and said, I didn't like that, so I'm canceling it. So the bureaucrat canceled a Supreme Court decision. Now, the government of Canada had from 1997 to 2004 to fix the law, and they never did. So with Bill C-71, to answer your question, the government or the judge's order, her stay of execution, if you will, expires on December 19th unless she extends it, which means that with or without a bill, people will be able to claim Canadian citizenship right then and there. So it will create some sort of chaos. So it will give quite an incentive to the next government to want to come in and fix it. The problem is that the Conservatives want to make it much more restrictive, and they are actually looking at, they view us as immigrants, not as citizens. They don't understand the difference, and they want to put the restrictions on lost Canadians to be harder to get into Canada than if you were an immigrant from some other country. So they'll have to do it. Will they follow the Benner rule and just never get to it? Don't know. I'm ready to go back to court, but I think our judge is going to force the issue on December 19th. It will be an interesting day.
Okay. And you know, Don, you and I were talking the other day about one of the, quote, individuals that you worked with Immigration and Citizenship Canada. And I noted that in his article, what he brought up was the millions of people that could be implicated in this legislation. And it causes me to wonder, do you think that we can point to the fact that this could have a huge impact on Canada if, in fact, millions of people from around the world claim their citizenship? What I'm wondering is, do you think that is affecting the government decision?
It's all the government. I was always in a catch-22 where the government said, how many people? Well, I don't know. But on the same token, if we said, well, there are only a handful, they'd say, then why are we passing a bill? We'll just do it case by case, which is their preferred method, but it doesn't work.
Yeah.
The other way was to say, well, there are a million people. Then they'd say, well, we can't because we don't want all those people coming up here. Yeah. Bill C-37 captured at least 1 million people. About 20,000 people have come into Canada from that. If I gave you citizenship tomorrow in Trinidad or in India or in Australia, you're probably not going to just pack your bags and move. And Canadians have kind of, they're good at drinking their own bathwater. It's saying, oh, we're the best country in the world. Americans are great at that too, at saying that. And granted, there are good and bad things to every country, but Canadians are saying, well, everybody's going to move here. No, they're not. They didn't under Bill C-37. They're not going to do it under Bill C-71, especially when you are retroactively changing the laws and people now have their grandchildren and their lives in another country. But there is a very important point of your culture and your heritage and who you are. Everybody should be proud of who they are. Now, if you saw, there's a really good movie on Nicholas Winton. I think it's called One Life. Nicholas Winton saved 600 and some Jewish kids from Czechoslovakia. Well, how many kids today or people are affected that are alive today because of what he did? 6, 7, 8,000 and growing, yet it started with 600 and some. So if we're going to give citizenship back to people like Walt Disney's family because his mother was denied, yeah, there are going to be a lot of people, into the millions of people that are affected. And probably you'll find a lot of people just amongst us here today, but how many will pack their bags and move to Canada? Lastly, Canada has said we want 500,000 people a year. Well, why not start with people that are already centered with roots in Canada? So there you go.
Thank you. This is from B. Did women born in Canada and women who are naturalized Canadian citizens lose their citizenship when marrying Americans?
Yes. Now, that was prior to 1947. Yes. So see, and the other thing, there are other avenues. Let's take where I'm in Bellingham, and there's Western Washington University. And down where you are, the University of Washington in Seattle. Well, the drinking age here was 21, up in Vancouver is 19. Where do you think all the kids went on the weekends? They went drinking in Vancouver, and they might have had a toddy or two too much. And guess what? Babies are made. And so a lot of cross-border babies. The other thing, if you go back to the 40s, is you had Canadian women that might get pregnant out of wedlock. And where did they end up having their baby? They came down to Bellingham or Seattle. And this is true across all of Canada and the United States. But where did the U.S. families go? They went north into Canada. So you have a huge area that we're correcting that as well. And if you saw the movie Philomena, and that is with Judi Dench, and this is with the Irish kids with the Catholic Church, who took the kids and ended up selling these kids. Well, the Catholic Church did this out of Montreal with a lot of kids, selling them to people in the United States. So there's a huge market of the baby rings, if you will, between the two countries. So there's a lot to this. But I always liked Millie Faye of the Bloc Québécois, who said there should be no limit to virtue. It's important to correct and right the wrongs. And I say this because I'm a very proud member of the Chinese community in Vancouver. And I've watched what they've gone through over the decades. And it's time to right their wrong and speaking up for what happened to them, because I mean, it's just appalling. And if you look at their story, Force 136, Operation Oblivion, you might find those stories on Amazon Prime. They're absolutely incredible stories that we need to know about. Over 100,000 Chinese landed on Vancouver Island during World War I and were sent across Canada and became part of the Allied movement. How many people know this? And so we need to tell their stories because they are just as Canadian as anybody else except the Indigenous, who, of course, are a step above all of us. Anything else?
Yes, we have a couple more questions. Nadine asked me to read the next one.
Yes.
This is from Steve Cuddy. What is the significance of the December 19th deadline for Bill C-71, an election, and what is the Conservative Party view on C-71?
C-71, they're trying to kill. They're in filibustering it right now. They are filibustering throughout Parliament have been for the last month and a bit. It's costing $1 million a day, as reported by the NDP yesterday in Parliament. So they've spent $20 million filibustering this. No business, nothing, zippo is getting through Parliament right now, with Bill C-71, the number one thing to be talked about the minute it gets through. I mean, the minute the filibuster goes away. There's a very good shot that they will filibuster right up until next year when there's an election. So we can kind of, at this point, I'm not counting on Bill C-71. So to answer the question, on December 19th, that's when the order at this point will expire, meaning instead of the government will have to abide by the judge's decision, meaning all these people that are currently being denied a right due to an unconstitutional law will have the right to immediately get citizenship. It will not be as large a scope as Bill C-71, and the Conservatives don't know what they're going to do.
Thank you. The next one is from Linda, who said she can ask this question herself if we like. So I'm going to let you go ahead and ask Linda.
Yeah, Linda.
Hi, John. Linda Yip here.
Oh, hi, Linda.
Very nice to see you. Excellent talk. Thank you. So I'm curious, aside from women, as Chinese persons seem to be the largest number of population on which Canada chose to practice its shifting ideas about citizenship, can you discuss what that would have been like for a person to try to do it the right way, as Kenny suggested, just build a good case and we'll consider your case and you'll become a citizen. So can you talk a little bit about that for a Chinese person pre-1947?
Yeah, no way. They didn't want them to begin with. And the one I think of so much that touches my heartstrings is Peggy Lee. Here is a woman that joined the military and drove an ambulance. Not only was she paid less because she's a woman, but she paid even less than a white woman. They zapped her in both ways. And it's quite appalling. It was, well, Linda, you're the expert in the Chinese history, and you know how awful these people had it. And they were Canadian citizens. So what the government did was not only say that you weren't a citizen, but they denied you any rights to participate in government. And yet, in law, what we're discovering is the Chinese were citizens. And
that's the part that really blows me away, because this history is complicated, right? It's complicated to understand. And since citizenship was defined in so many different ways, and it seems subjectively, depending on need and naturalization withheld, that even today, I could not reliably explain citizenship if somebody asked me. Like, I rely on you, Don.
Well, especially if you go back with the misinformation that was going on.
Exactly.
Like Newfoundland became part of Canada in March of 1949. And the agreement for them to join Canada was that all Newfies would be deemed to be born or to be Canadian citizens back to their date of birth or date of domicile. So if citizenship didn't exist in Canada before 1947, then the Newfies were Canada's first citizens. None of this makes sense. What more can I say is, oh, what a tangled web we weave when at first we try to deceive. And Mackenzie King was a misogynist, an anti-Semite, a racist. I mean, the Pattullo Bridge, Duff Pattullo, the then premier of British Columbia, actually went to King and said, we don't want you to allow any Chinese into the war. And now we have a bridge named after that guy in Canada. It should be changed. But, King Mackenzie King went along with this stuff. So it's time to right the wrong. I feel very strongly that my pilot side, we have to tell it like it is, and you rescue everybody.
Yeah. And where can we find more about those stories, Don?
Nobody's researched it. So you can see that I've got a lawsuit ready to go. I mean, it is ready to file. And And I'll send you some information on it because we have a Fred Colburn, one of my team members. He died a while back. He was in his 90s. Best researcher, legal analyst I've ever seen. And he did a 100-page document on it. And I wrote a little narrative, like a 27 or 30-page narrative of Canada. And I have gotten feedback on that by the chief of staff to the current citizenship minister, who read it and went, "Oh my God, you're absolutely right. It existed." And when I said about the Benner case and the bureaucrats ignoring it, well, in 1938, there was a woman born in Victoria of Chinese descent. She left Canada, came back, and they said, no, you haven't paid your head tax. You can't come in. She went to court, Supreme Court decision, Sin Shem versus the King, 1938, and they said, the Exclusion Act doesn't apply to Canadian citizens. She was born in Canada. She's a citizen. Wait a minute.
Yeah.
Why isn't this in the public knowledge? Why aren't we teaching this in the school system? And I'm afraid that, geez, to use an American analogy, the Ron DeSantis of the world aren't new. Canada had its share as well.
Well, thank you, Don. I'll let you go.
Anything else?
We have an interesting question here, Don.
Yes.
Concerning French Canadian.
Yes.
And individuals from Quebec, from a descendant of French Canadian grandparents, one of my colleagues in the Jackson School. Annette asks, do lost Canadians also include French Canadians? Would you please discuss this issue?
Yes. In fact, I've worked a lot with the Bloc Québécois. I'm working with them right now. And unlike the English side of the members of parliament, the Bloc understands identity and culture. They get it. Just it's inherent in the French almost. So they are very big on the issue of supporting lost Canadians. I have unanimous support within the Bloc. Actually, I have it with the Greens and the NDP and the Liberals right now. With the nuances of Quebec, the one problem was if you were Jewish or you weren't Catholic, is probably a better way to say it. We've had lost Canadians that are from Quebec and Jewish. And at the time, going way back, there were no birth certificates. There were baptismal certificates. So the church kept your baptismal certificate, which in the ensuing 100+ years or whatever, they could easily have been in a church that burnt down, lost, or whatever. So there were no real records if you're trying to prove that your grandfather was born in Quebec. But we've been able to be successful in using the Canadian census to kind of fix that. And we've not had blowback by the government right now. So yes, they are just as much. And in terms of my pilot side, I'm not about to leave the French Canadians behind either.
So Dawn, our last question is from B. Can you briefly offer your opinion on what the difference in scope will be between the court-ordered version and the C-71 version post-December for people interested in pursuing proof of citizenship?
I don't know the difference. I'd be guessing, but I went to the current citizenship minister's chief of staff and I said, okay, look, there are 6 deficiencies in the Citizenship Act and we need to get them corrected. And here's on the gender discrimination. This is a court case that absolutely mirrors everything that's going on in Canada with the gender discrimination, the historic gender discrimination. And that was a Supreme Court in England. And the woman who brought it was saying, I don't have the same rights retroactively as men to confer citizenship. So she won that case. Now, I went, as I say, to the chief of staff and I said, look, I'll bring the same case. And it's already got a decision in England and it's going to be really hard for you to argue it. So they wrote that into Bill C-71. In essence, what they were saying is, if you had a Canadian parent or should have had a Canadian parent, if not for the discrimination, you're in. The judge will not be that liberal. She is talking about first and second generation born abroad, and that's all. So Bill C-71 is the element that really makes it with huge ramifications. The Nicholas Winton point that I was making earlier is the fact that it's retroactive for women's rights. If we don't get it, and the conservatives don't want to do it, well, they'll see me around for a few more years on campus.
Don, on behalf of everyone here, I want to thank you so much. There were a number of comments in the chat about just thanks for your work, for your dedication, for changing lives of many people, for your endless advocacy for lost Canadians, and then the informative and interesting presentation. So lots of thank yous to you. I want to say, and just end with your analogy, using your experience as an airline pilot and taking the knowledge and the wisdom from being an airline pilot and applying that to leadership and how you've approached this leadership, I think is just enormously interesting. And I think about John Lewis, who has a book out on leadership, and he used his experience in civil rights to write about what is leadership, what are the components of leadership. And I just think it's perhaps not the main area you're focusing on, but how you bring that in is most interesting.
Thank you. And there are a lot of people, I've seen some, like I'm looking at Jack Jen, Kat LeBlanc, Linda Yep. These are people one day you should entertain or have them talk. Jack is very involved in a movie project talking about Freddie Lee, who was born back at the beginning of the century in the 1900s, died fighting for Canada, is Chinese, and I want to make him a real Canadian. There are a lot of people here I owe thank you to. I owe you a thank you for caring. We all stand on somebody's shoulders. And so thank you for helping. Thank you for passing the word and spreading it. And Marion, thank you. So anyway, there'll be another chapter. I don't know where. Let me end it with this, that there are going to be climate refugees. They're coming. They're not, you can't stop them. So I would love one day to do a conference on climate refugees and citizenship. And politicians are very good at reacting after the fact. If pilots did that, you'd have a lot of plane crashes. We try to anticipate. And so I'd like, I think a worldwide conference would be very good on that subject. And citizenship is a big deal. It's the right to have rights. Thank you to everybody today. And
thank you so much, Don, and thank you everyone who is with us today. It's fantastic to see you here. Thank you, Marion, and I hope we see you at one of our upcoming events. Just great event. Thanks, Don.
Thank you.